March 6th, 1939. Fingringhoe, England. After purchasing some cigarettes at a local pub, 67-year-old Ada Constance Kent seems to disappear, and over the course of the next decade, numerous searches of her empty cottage fail to turn up any trace of her. 10 years later, a human skeleton is discovered beneath some rubble in the cottage's bedroom, and after a forensic examination is performed, there is uncertainty about who the remains belong to. When an inquest is held, a coroner's jury does eventually conclude that the victim is likely Ada Constance Kent, but since they are unable to determine her exact cause of death, they return an open verdict, and the case remains shrouded in mystery. After that, the trail went cold. Hello everyone, and welcome to our latest episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Warder, and for the second consecutive week, we're going to be traveling to the United Kingdom to explore an incredibly bizarre mystery: the 1939 disappearance and unexplained death of Ada Constance Kent. So as you probably know, our podcast is continuing the tradition of counting down to October the 31st by spending the rest of this month covering unsolved mysteries which either took place on Halloween or have some sort of creepy Halloween slant to them. And needless to say, this story definitely qualifies as an example of the latter. It takes place in the English village of Fingringhoe, which is probably the greatest name for a location we've ever shared on the show. I first became familiar with the case nearly 11 years ago when I published an article for listverse.com about 10 deceased victims who were discovered in strange places, and at the time, I considered this to be one of the weirdest mysteries I'd ever seen. It involves an elderly spinster named Ada Constance Kent, who went by the name Connie, and while she had apparently once been a successful actress, it seems like she was content to spend her golden years living in relative seclusion at her cottage in Fingringhoe. Sometime in 1939, Connie just seemed to vanish without a trace, but 10 years later, a skeleton that was presumed to be her was discovered beneath some rubble in her bedroom, lying in a narrow passage between the bed and a dressing table. The problem is that Connie's cottage had been searched numerous times during the 10-year window she was missing, and virtually everyone was certain that this skeleton was not there. In fact, there was even speculation that the skeleton may have been a completely different person, but when an inquest was held, a coroner's jury ultimately concluded that the remains most likely did belong to Connie, though they were unable to determine her cause of death. Now, given that this is an older mystery, it probably won't surprise you to learn that a number of details surrounding this story have been greatly embellished and exaggerated over the years in order to provide an extra aura of mystery and creepiness. And of course, when these details get repeatedly shared by many different sources, they eventually come to be accepted as fact. Well, I've gone back and looked through the original press coverage of this story, so on this episode, I'm going to attempt to discern which details are accurate and which are complete nonsense, and we'll see if we can figure out what happened and determine if this case really is as mysterious as it's been made out to be. Anyway, before we get started, just a quick reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast, which is currently available for download on several platforms, including Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, YouTube Music, Podcast Addict, and more. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it, and please leave us a rating or review on any of those sites to help spread the word and garner us more exposure. The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so if you would like to learn how to support the show, please visit our page at patreon.com/thetrailwentcold. For as little as $1 a month, you can garner access to exclusive rewards, including stickers and thank you cards, early access to episodes, and bonus content. As our Patreon page has nearly 90 exclusive bonus episodes and archives, which are not available on a regular feed. I also wanted to announce that this coming Saturday, October the 25th, we'll be holding one of our annual Unsolved Mysteries live watch marathons, in which I screen classic segments from the show, and you can watch them and chat with myself and your fellow listeners. And of course, since it's near the end of October, this will be a special Halloween-themed live watch featuring a number of the show's paranormal segments. It's taking place at 8 p.m. Eastern Time, and if you'd like to join us, you can find the link to our screening room in our show notes, as well as pinned to the top of our social media pages. Hope to see you there. So with all that out of the way, let us now explore the death of Ada Constance Kent. Our story begins in 1939 in Fingringhoe, England, a village located in the city of Colchester district of Essex, which had a population of around 200 people at that time. Our central figure is Ada Constance Kent, who is believed to be 67 years old at this time and goes by the name Connie. Details of Connie's life are vague, but an historian/genealogist named Helen Barrell was able to dig up some details. She found a birth index entry for Ada Constance Kent from 1871, as it appears that she was born in Fingringhoe to her mother, Helen Ann Kent, but since there is no record of Connie's father, she may have been an illegitimate child. Census records from 1881 and 1891 list Connie as living in Colchester with Helen Ann Kent and a widow named Mary Ann Kent, who is likely Connie's maternal grandmother. However, Ada Constance Kent's name is not listed in any census records after 1891, and while we'll go into more detail about this later on, legend has it that Connie left Essex in order to pursue a career as a stage actress in London and may have performed under the name Vera Verchael. While this portion of Connie's life is shrouded in mystery, it appears that she eventually retired from her acting career and returned to Essex sometime in 1928. She initially lived in another cottage and wrote a letter to the local council to inquire about making repairs to Church Cottage so that she could move in there. Church Cottage was a small two-room structure located at Whalebone Corner in Fingringhoe, and it sounds like this matter with the council was never officially resolved, as Connie pretty much took illegal possession of the cottage and moved in there. And even though local council officials were not particularly happy about this, they did not take any action and just let Connie stay there. For the next decade, Connie was known for being a reclusive and eccentric spinster who had few friends and did not socialize much with others, and she was often described as being unfriendly and bad-tempered. On March 6, 1939, Connie paid a visit to the Whalebone Inn, a pub which was located across the road from her cottage, as she regularly went there to purchase packets of Woodbine brand cigarettes. She bought a pack from the pub's landlord, Alfred Hassler, who would later describe Connie as looking very ill and having a violent cough. After Connie left the pub, this turned out to be the last time she was confirmed to be alive, though it's been reported that neighbors saw a light burning in her cottage window until about 9 p.m. that night before it went out. A pint of milk was delivered to the college door the following morning, but it remained there unclaimed. Over the course of the next several weeks, all pints of milk delivered to Church Cottage were not picked up, and whenever anyone knocked on the door, there was no answer. Connie's best friend in the area was a woman known only as Mrs. Maskell, who lived in Colchester, so Alfred Hassler took the step of notifying her about Connie's absence and asked her to check Church Cottage. Mrs. Maskell paid a visit there, but even though she knocked on the door and peeked in through the windows, it does not sound like she actually went inside the cottage. Mrs. Maskell did not see Connie, but since she was apparently in the habit of leaving the area for long periods of time without telling anyone, there was not initially concern about Connie's disappearance. However, 3 months passed and Connie did not resurface, so Mrs. Maskell returned to Church Cottage, but even though she went inside this time, she claimed she did not see Connie there. Connie's closest neighbor was a gardener named George Winkle, who lived in another cottage about 40 yards away and sometimes did odd jobs for her. Sometime in late 1939 or early 1940, George started noticing that local children were breaking into Church Cottage in order to play. This prompted George to contact the Essex police at their headquarters in Chelmsford, and a police constable named Bernard Constable agreed to perform his own search of the cottage. And yes, you heard that right, his name was literally Constable Constable. George agreed to accompany Constable when he entered the cottage, and they found a supper tray containing a cup and a teapot resting on top of the dining table. A copy of William Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet was found lying open next to a chair by the fireplace, and a pair of slippers were resting nearby. However, they could not find any sign of Connie inside the cottage, or clues that shed any light on what might have happened to her. Since World War II had begun at this point, and it was about to become a tumultuous time in the United Kingdom, it was not exactly a top priority to launch a missing persons investigation for Connie, and many of the police's records during this time period wound up being donated to the wartime salvage drive. However, there was still speculation that Connie may have left voluntarily and returned to London to resume her stage career and entertain the troops who were stationed there. George Winkle claimed he returned to Church Cottage in 1942 to perform an additional search, but once again found nothing, and the cottage seemed to be in the same condition as when Connie vanished. Over the next several years, the cottage became more dilapidated, and the local council wanted to tear it down, but they were legally unable to do so without Connie's permission. Well, in March of 1949, the Essex police finally decided to perform another search of the cottage, but there are conflicting accounts about why they agreed to do so. One version is that the Essex police chief, Clarence Webb, saw children playing in the abandoned cottage and decided that another investigation should be performed. But it's also been reported that the police felt compelled to perform a new search after receiving a phone call from the Cooperative Wholesale Society Bank, who were inquiring about a dormant account they had under Ada Constance Kent's name, which contained over £50 but had not been touched in over 10 years. Now, some sources you'll find out there claim that a mysterious deposit had been made to the account in September of 1948, so the bank was attempting to get in touch with Connie in order to confirm the transaction. However, I've done a search at newspapers.com and read all the contemporary press coverage of this case, and none of these articles mention anything about this deposit, so I think this is a completely fabricated detail which has retroactively been added to the story over the years in order to add more mystery, but I cannot find any credible sources to confirm that the 1948 deposit actually happened. Regardless, the Essex police decided to pay a visit to Church Cottage on March the 20th, 1949. By this point, the door's rusty lock had been busted, likely by children who broke inside in order to play, but while the cottage was now in a state of disarray, it still contained some valuable furniture and a number of Chinese curios, as well as a series of papers, letters, and photographs, which seemed to show that Connie had been a stage actress during her younger days. For the next 2 days, it sounds like the authorities searched the area and dredged a nearby pond, but found nothing. However, on March the 22nd, a police sergeant named Thomas Waylett decided to perform a search of the upstairs bedroom, which measured about 14 feet by 6 feet, and the bed was reported as still being made and not slept in. Over the past few years, a bough from a nearby tree had actually crashed through the bedroom's roof, creating a hole and filling the room with rubble covered with dust and cobwebs. When Sergeant Waylett started moving the rubble aside, he was shocked to discover what appeared to be some bones in a narrow passage between the bed and a dressing table. He soon uncovered a skull and enough bones to comprise a full human skeleton. There were remnants of rotting clothing on the skeleton, which was also resting alongside a bottle which had the word poison written on the label. The victim's skull was intact and still had some tufts of hair on it, which later wound up being matched to some hair in a brush that was resting on the dresser. The skeleton would be removed from the cottage and taken to Scotland Yard in London for a forensic examination, and a pair of detectives from the Essex Police Criminal Investigation Division were assigned to handle the case. But word soon spread about the discovery of the remains, so by the time the detectives arrived at Church Cottage, it was filled with reporters, and the story wound up garnering worldwide press coverage. As a result, the police elected not to perform a thorough search of the cottage until early the next morning after all the reporters were gone. Even though the cottage had been broken into numerous times over the years, jewels and money were found inside, so it did not appear that any robbery took place. Naturally, it was immediately suspected that the skeletal remains belonged to Connie, but the police were unable to trace any living relatives for her. Essex Police Chief Clarence Webb told the press, quote, "In all probability, Miss Kent collapsed and died a lonely death of natural causes, but the possibility of foul play cannot be ruled out for the time being." End quote. Since an empty bottle with a poison label was found near the remains, police confirmed that they could not completely rule out the possibility that Connie had intentionally ingested some poison and her death was a suicide. By this point, P.C. Bernard Constable had retired, but when he learned about what happened, he maintained that the skeleton had not been inside Church Cottage when he performed his original search 9 years earlier. He stated, quote, "Somebody must have died in that cottage a long time after the old lady vanished. I'm ready to swear there was no body the day we searched." End quote. Likewise, George Winkle, who searched the cottage on 2 separate occasions, was also certain that the skeleton had not been there, stating, quote, "There was no body, no skeleton, nobody in the cottage that day. The floors were clean and bare, and I looked under the bed and furniture." End quote. By this point, Connie's former friend, Mrs. Maskell, the other known person who had searched the cottage, had passed away and could not comment on the situation. Well, by late April, Scotland Yard had supposedly completed their examination of the skeleton, and a press release came out that stated they had issued their forensic report, in which they revealed that they were not entirely convinced that the remains belonged to Connie. Obviously, DNA profiling was not a thing back in 1949, and I do not believe that Connie had any dental records, but the story goes that after using superimposed photographs of her to make a comparison, Scotland Yard felt the skeleton did not correspond with Connie's height and other known measurements. Now, this is yet another detail about this case which has been greatly embellished over the years, as a number of sources report that the skeleton was positively determined not to be Connie, which isn't true. I've also seen some sources state that the authorities thought the victim was male, but I haven't seen this mentioned in any of the contemporary press coverage. At the time, there was a press release that the Essex police held a press conference to announce that the remains did not belong to Connie, but they quickly debunked this, and here was their response, quote, "The Essex police have not had a report on the remains from Scotland Yard. No conference was held on Tuesday. No inquest has been fixed. As far as the Essex Police HQ is concerned, there is no truth in this story, and so far, the police believe that the skeleton is that of Miss Kent." End quote. In fact, Scotland Yard also wound up contradicting the press release and confirmed that they had not issued the forensic report yet. But upon the release of this information, George Winkle provided this statement about the skeleton, quote, "If it wasn't Miss Kent, it must have been an old tramp who went in to spend the night and collapsed and died. Hundreds of strangers came here during the war, but we would have known if anyone went there permanently." End quote. Under the circumstances, I can understand where the confusion about the identification of the remains came from, but as we're going to talk about momentarily, the authorities would eventually reach what they believed was a definitive conclusion. In July of that year, F.E.M. Puxon, the deputy coroner for Northeast Essex, held an inquest in the town of Witham, in which all the evidence would be presented in front of a coroner's jury made up of 9 men, who also got the opportunity to view the skeletal remains. Testimony was provided by the Essex County pathologist Dr. Francis Camps, who attempted to demonstrate the similarities between the victim and the description which had been provided of Connie. Dr. Camps said there was no evidence of injury to the skull or the neck to suggest that strangulation had taken place. The victim's spine contained evidence of arthritis, and both the spine and the ribs had been partially eaten away by rodents. Since the skeleton was found lying on its left side, its right arm was slightly raised and had been dislocated from the shoulder. Even though a bottle with a poison label was found near the remains, Dr. Camps did not believe poisoning was the cause of death, though he could not definitively rule out all forms of poison. Of course, testimony was provided by P.C. Bernard Constable and George Winkle, who recounted the searches they performed of Church Cottage and continued to maintain that they did not see the skeleton there at those times. However, some additional testimony was provided by a young man named Derek Allen, who claimed that in 1940, when he was 12 years old, he and some other friends broke into the cottage. Derek stated, quote, "We climbed through a tiny window and played hide and seek in the bedroom where the skeleton was found, even crawling under the bed. We only saw some small bones we thought a dog had left." End quote. Derek claimed that since he and his friends did not believe the bones were human, they did not report their discovery to anyone. Another key witness was Ethel Dorman, the head mistress of the local school, who claimed that in January of 1940, some children informed her about a horrible smell they had detected from Church Cottage. At the time, she assumed that the smell may have been dead rodents and advised the authorities to go check the cottage, though it's unclear if they did much of a search. But it was around this same time period that Constable and Winkle performed their own search of the cottage, and they both claimed they did not detect any foul odors. But according to Dr. Camps, it did not appear that the victim's body had decomposed in a traditional fashion, and there was some evidence of mummification. If the victim was Connie and she had passed away sometime during the spring of 1939, the mummification may have been caused by the conditions of the atmosphere, since the weather during that time period was pretty cold. Before the inquest began, Puxon predicted that if the coroner's jury were unable to determine an exact cause of death, they would likely return an open verdict, and that is exactly what happened. The jury ultimately concluded that the remains likely did belong to Connie, and one of their biggest deciding factors was that the skull had slight protruding front teeth, which Connie was also known to have. But since they were unable to determine Connie's cause of death, or say where or when her death occurred, they returned an open verdict. The investigation into Connie's death pretty much came to an end, and Church Cottage was finally torn down in 1954. The story faded from the spotlight, though, like I've already mentioned, it seems like a bunch of false or completely exaggerated details have been added to the story in its numerous retellings over the years. In 2005, a Colchester-based historian named Patrick Denny published a book titled Foul Deeds and Suspicious Deaths in and Around Colchester, and it contained a chapter about Connie's story titled The Riddle of the Fingringhoe Skeleton, which was largely fact-based and only shared information that was obtained from the contemporary press coverage and original police reports. In August of 2016, the story would be the subject of an episode of the BBC Radio 4 series Punt PI, titled The Reclusive Skeleton of Fingringhoe. The series was hosted by writer/presenter Steve Punt, who actually managed to interview some elderly individuals who had lived in Fingringhoe and the surrounding area during the 1940s and shared first-hand memories of Connie's disappearance and the discovery of the skeleton. The episode also delved more deeply into Connie's background, but I'll share more details about this later on in this episode. According to the 1949 Death Index, the skeleton was buried in a churchyard in the village of Coggeshall, possibly because that's where Connie's mother was buried when she passed away in 1921. However, I'm not sure if the skeleton's exact burial spot has ever been determined, so it's unclear if its resting place bears a headstone with Connie's name. All we know for certain is that since the coroner's jury returned an open verdict at the inquest, this case was never officially considered to be solved, so the disappearance and death of Ada Constance Kent continues to remain shrouded in mystery. So I guess you could say the trail went cold. So whenever I release Halloween-themed episodes on this podcast every October, one approach I sometimes like to use is selecting infamous mysteries which occurred several decades ago and contain a lot of odd, creepy, and inexplicable details. And more often than not, I discover that many of the retellings of these stories have been littered with misinformation, and some of the most memorable details have been greatly exaggerated or outright fabricated in order to enhance the aura of mystery. For instance, back on episode number 300, I covered the saga of the Bennington Triangle from Vermont, where one of the most mysterious details was that an elderly man named James Tedford supposedly vanished into thin air on a moving bus back in 1949, but of course, when I researched this story, I learned it was completely false. I've also done episodes on 2 other World War II era mysteries which took place in Britain during the 1940s, including the saga of Who Put Bella in the Witch Elm and the 1945 murder of Charles Walton, where I did my best to try to separate fact from fiction. In the Charles Walton case, it was often shared that a cross was found carved into his chest in order to enhance the narrative that his murder was connected to witchcraft, but it turned out that there was no mention of this cross in the original autopsy report, police reports, or contemporary news coverage. But a lot of these inaccurate details have been shared so often over the past several decades that they're often accepted as fact. We definitely have examples of this in the Ada Constance Kent case, such as this mysterious deposit that was supposedly made to her bank account in September of 1948, 6 months before her skeleton was discovered. But, like I mentioned earlier, there was no mention of this in the original news coverage, as it was only reported that her bank contacted the police to inquire about her current whereabouts, since a small amount of money had laid dormant in her account for a decade. I have no idea where this detail about the 1948 deposit originated from, but learning that it's not true does suck some of the mystery out of the story. It's also been reported as a confirmed fact in some places that the authorities were absolutely certain that the skeleton found in Church Cottage was not Connie and possibly belonged to a male, and if this was accurate, this would be a truly baffling and multi-layered mystery with a bunch of unanswered questions. But even though they lacked the forensics at the time to say with 100% certainty that the remains belonged to Connie, the police and the coroner's jury at the inquest did ultimately conclude that it was probably her. While I would love them to resolve this issue once and for all by exhuming the remains and performing DNA testing to confirm that they belong to Connie, I can understand this not being a top priority for the authorities, as this is not considered to be an unsolved homicide, and like I just mentioned, I'm not sure anyone knows Connie's exact final resting place. If you go to newspapers.com, you'll see that the discovery of the skeleton in the cottage got media coverage all over the world, as press releases about the story were printed not just in English newspapers, but North American and Australian ones as well. It's also quite amusing to read that when the detectives assigned to handle the case first arrived at Church Cottage, it was overrun with reporters, so they decided not to perform their own search until the following morning, after all the reporters had left. It's not clear why the detectives simply couldn't have ordered the reporters to leave, and it's probably a good thing that this didn't turn into a full-fledged homicide investigation, since I can only imagine how much potential evidence might have been compromised. Anyway, this story was reported on non-stop for just over 3 months, but after the inquest concluded in July, it pretty much faded from the spotlight. However, I noticed that when newspapers started publishing articles about this story in subsequent years, their articles would contain a number of false or embellished details, which made this story almost sound like an urban legend or some sort of creepypasta. Hell, I've seen some sources make truly ridiculous claims, such as the skeleton being found clad in an evening gown at a seat at the dinner table in front of an unfinished meal. One aspect of this story which is technically true is that since the coroner's journey cannot determine Connie's exact cause of death, it was officially classified as undetermined, though the Essex police said they did not find any noticeable evidence to indicate that she was the victim of foul play. And one detail which sounds exaggerated, but actually did turn out to be true, was that the skeleton was found next to an empty bottle, which literally had the word poison written on the label. While the Essex County pathologist, Dr. Francis Camps, did not personally believe that poisoning was the exact cause of death, I suppose we can't completely discount the possibility that Connie willingly ingested poison in order to end her own life. However, we cannot overlook the fact that Connie was 67 years old at the time she went missing, and the last known person to see her alive, Alfred Hassler, described her as looking ill and having a bad cough when he sold her a pack of cigarettes. So it's totally believable that she could have simply died of natural causes. But the big unanswered question which has always kept this case shrouded in mystery is whether Connie could have actually been lying dead inside her cottage for 10 consecutive years without being found, and whether it's possible that multiple people ventured in there during that time period and somehow missed her remains. Well, before we discuss this any further, we have to talk about Connie herself. I just made mention of an episode about this case which was broadcast on the BBC4 radio series Punt PI, and it featured an interview with genealogist Helen Barrell, who had done extensive research into Connie's background. It appears that Connie was born in Fingringhoe to her mother, Helen Ann Kent, and since there doesn't appear to be any information about who her father was, she was likely an illegitimate child. I'm sure that would have been the most scandalous thing ever back in the 1870s, and perhaps it played a role in Connie's decision to never get married. Connie's name appears in the 1881 and 1891 census records from the area, but not after that, which lends credence to the idea that she left the area to pursue a career in acting and spent the next several decades traveling the world. The name Ada Constance Kent doesn't appear in any official records until the 1949 Death Index, and it's been reported that she may have acted under the stage name Vera Verchale. If you look at the historical context, it would make perfect sense for Connie to take on a pseudonym, since she just happened to share the name of one of England's most notorious murderers. You see, in 1860, 16-year-old Constance Emily Kent, who lived in the village of Rode, became a suspect in the murder of her 4-year-old half-brother Francis, who was abducted from his bedroom, stabbed, and had his throat slashed so deeply that the boy was nearly decapitated. As you can imagine, the idea of a 16-year-old girl committing a crime like that would have been unheard of back then, so Constance was not charged with the murder until she made a confession 5 years later, and after she pleaded guilty, she was sentenced to death. Constance's sentence wound up being commuted to life imprisonment, and after she served 20 years, she was released in 1885 at the age of 41. She wound up relocating to Australia and actually lived to the age of 100 before she passed away in 1944. Well, by the time Ada Constance Kent started pursuing her acting career during the 1890s, Constance Emily Kent was already a free woman, so it's understandable that Connie would elect to take on a different name. So there really isn't much information out there about Connie's life between 1891 and when she returned to Fingringhoe in 1928. While she was a very reclusive person who didn't talk much about her acting career, she did apparently tell a local grocer that she had once been a member of the suffragette movement, which was organized by political activist Emmeline Pankhurst and fought for earning British women the right to vote. Connie even claimed that she once participated in a suffrage demonstration organized by Emmeline's daughter, Sylvia Pankhurst, in which a bunch of women chained themselves to the railings in London's Hyde Park, and Connie wound up getting arrested for it and spending time in Holloway Prison. It's also been reported by the villagers that Connie had once told someone that the reason she never got married was because she had been jilted when she was young. So it seems like the information about Connie's acting career is based on a bunch of papers, letters, and photographs which were found inside her cottage. The only photo I've seen of her is a faded image from around 1900 or so that was featured in Patrick Denny's book, Foul Deeds and Suspicious Deaths in and around Colchester. It's still up for debate if the woman in the photo was actually Connie, but as far as I can tell, no photographs of her as an elderly woman from the last decade of her life living in Fingringhoe actually exist. Obviously, Vera Verchale is not the most common name in the world, but if you do a search under that name on Google or at newspapers.com, the only matches you're going to get are websites or articles which mention this case. And historians have also not had much luck turning up any information about Vera Verchale. However, records show that Connie's mother, Helen Ann Kent, worked as a seamstress, so one interesting theory pushed forward on Punt PI is that Connie followed in her mother's footsteps and actually became a seamstress who created garments and costumes for a number of stage productions rather than an actress. It's also been reported that Connie had a number of silk dresses and fur coats which were folded up and hidden inside cushion covers at Church Cottage, which would make sense if she had spent many years making clothing. Working as a seamstress could have allowed Connie the opportunity to travel the world and enjoy a long theatrical career in a behind-the-scenes capacity, And if she still decided to go under the name Vera Verchale without actually appearing on stage, this could explain why there seems to be so little information about her. While the details of Connie's life between the 1890s and late 1920s are probably forever destined to remain a mystery, it's well established that she became a very reclusive person when she returned to Fingringhoe and was not particularly talkative or friendly with the other village residents. Given the circumstances, it's understandable that no real missing persons investigation was performed for Connie after she disappeared, especially given that World War II soon began and the country had much bigger priorities. Obviously, most of the people who would have personally interacted with Connie or lived in Fingringhoe during that time period are long deceased, but the Punt PI radio episode came out in 2016, and Steve Punt was able to secure a few interviews with some elderly village residents who were children at the time Connie went missing and could still share their memories of what happened. And not surprisingly, some of them have first-hand accounts of breaking into Church Cottage to play once word spread that no one was living there. For instance, one of the interviewees was a woman named Jean Watcham, who claimed that after entering the cottage with her friends when she was a child, she went upstairs and stood in the bedroom doorway before one of her companions pushed her inside. Jean said that the room was pitch black, and when she went down onto the floor, her hand wound up touching something under the bed, which she assumed was a rolled-up carpet. As a prank, Jean told her friends that somebody was dead in there, which caused them to hightail out of the cottage in fear, though Jean confirmed that she never actually saw anything in the darkness. The book Foul Deeds and Suspicious Deaths in and Around Colchester also featured an interview snippet with John Hedges, another individual who frequently played inside the cottage during his youth, and he personally believed that most of the kids who did this never ventured upstairs to go into the bedroom. And that sounds pretty believable, as I'm sure they may have found it too spooky to enter a dark room inside an abandoned cottage where a woman mysteriously went missing. Perhaps the most surprising comment from an interviewee on the Punt PI episode was from a former village resident named Frank King, who claimed that Connie left a trunk of belongings at the Whalebone Inn around the time she disappeared and never returned to reclaim them. If true, this could imply that Connie left the area voluntarily to go on some sort of trip, but I have not seen this detail about the trunk corroborated by any other source. As you might recall, the last known witness to have interacted with Connie was the inn's landlord, Alfred Hassler, who claimed he sold her a pack of cigarettes, but there's never been any mention of him receiving a trunk. It was apparently common practice for Connie to leave the village for long periods of time without telling anyone where she was going, so I don't know if it's feasible if she could have left Fingringhoe in March of 1939 and then returned to Church Cottage at a later time before she died there, which could explain why nothing was found during the original searches. After Connie left the Whalebone Inn, there were reports that a light was seen burning in her cottage window until around 9 p.m. that night before it went out. Theoretically, if Connie went to sleep right after this and died of natural causes, could she have rolled out of bed and wound up in that narrow passage next to the dressing table, where she remained undiscovered for the next decade? Well, as unbelievable as that may seem, there are numerous documented cases of reclusive people who died inside the residence and remained there for years before anyone found their body. A prominent example of this from the modern era involved a British woman named Joyce Vincent, who pretty much cut off all contact with everyone she knew before she died inside her London flat sometime in December of 2003 at the age of 38, of what was believed to either be an asthma attack or complications from a recent peptic ulcer. Since Joyce had become a complete recluse, no one ever reported her missing until her decomposed skeletal remains were discovered inside her flat just over 2 years later in January of 2006. During that 2-year window, many of Joyce's bills were still being paid through automatic debit, so the television and the heating were still running at the time her remains were found. Of course, even though there's a major difference between going undiscovered for 2 years and 10 years, I don't believe Connie had to worry about paying rent or bills for utilities, and like I just mentioned, people have much bigger priorities while living in war-torn Britain during the 1940s. Of course, Church Cottage became very dilapidated throughout the decade, and while the local council wanted to clear out the place and tear it down, they were legally unable to do so without Connie's permission. And since they could not find her or officially confirm she was deceased, it was the ultimate catch-22 for them. So when the inquest took place in 1949, 3 people testified in front of the coroner's jury about their experiences being inside Church Cottage during the time period Connie was missing. Since her closest friend, Mrs. Maskell, had passed away, the 3 primary witnesses were P.C. Bernard Constable, Connie's closest neighbor, George Winkle, and Derek Allen, who broke into the cottage when he was only 12 years old. I should mention that there's a bizarre postscript to this story involving George Winkle, as on September the 24th, 1955, his body was found hanging in an empty room of his own cottage, and he was 64 at the time of his death. 3 weeks earlier, George had stopped the deliveries of his milk and newspapers and told people he was leaving on holiday, but in retrospect, it seemed apparent that he had made the decision to take his own life. George was a lifelong bachelor who always lived alone, and according to those who knew him, whenever he was asked about Church Cottage or Ada Constance Kent, he fell silent and never wanted to talk about it. Naturally, there was always speculation that George may have known more about Connie's death than he was letting on, and that this may have played a role in his suicide. Well, one of George's acquaintances said that everything you could share about his personal life would hardly cover a postage stamp, so we'll probably never know why he did what he did. What we do know is that George was always adamant that the skeleton was not inside Church Cottage when he searched it in 1940 and 1942. He was also skeptical the remains even belonged to Connie, and theorized that some transient may have broken into the cottage because they needed a place to stay and wound up dying there. The detail which does give me pause is that George specifically said during an interview that during his second search, he looked under the bed and the furniture and found nothing, and if he is telling the truth, then it is hard to imagine that he could have missed the skeleton. P.C. Constable accompanied George during his first search, and he also held the same attitude that there's no way he could have missed the remains if they had been there. But their accounts may be contradicted by Derek Allen, who claimed he was playing hide-and-seek with some other kids in the cottage in 1940 and saw what appeared to be some small bones under the bed, though they initially wrote them off as dog bones. Well, Derek's account makes me wonder if there were other kids who broke into the cottage during that 10-year window and found something, but elected to keep their mouths shut, either because they were left traumatized or they just didn't want to get into trouble. It has also been reported that it was common practice during that time period for some of the local boys to tease the girls about not going into Church Cottage because Ada Constance Kent was lying dead under the bed. But it's unclear if this was nothing more than a joke or a rumor that got started because some kid legitimately did see something. Now, I've spoken of numerous cases on this podcast where massive search efforts were performed for a missing person in a wooded or rural area and turned up nothing, but years after the fact, the victims' remains were discovered in the exact same area because they had been missed by the searchers the first time around. Yes, there's a major difference between missing skeletal remains in the outdoors rather than a small 2-room building, but how thorough were these searches of Church Cottage? Well, as certain as P.C. Constable might have been that there was no skeleton in the cottage, he said during his inquest testimony that when he went upstairs, he found the bedroom door ajar. But he also admitted that he never actually entered the room and only peeked inside and saw no sign of a body. Remember, the skeleton was found wedged in a narrow passage between the bed and a dressing table, so would it have even been visible from the doorway? I have to harken back to the interview with Jean Watcham on the Punt PI episode, who claimed she broke into the cottage sometime during the 1940s, and when she stood in the doorway, she said the bedroom was pitch black. And after she was knocked over by her friends, Jean said that her hand went under the bed, and she wound up touching something which felt like a rolled-up carpet, but she couldn't actually see what it was. The contemporary news coverage of this case never mentioned anything about the bedroom being pitch black, but if there were no windows in there and there was no electricity, it makes sense that there wouldn't be any illumination unless someone went in there with a candle or a flashlight or something. And remember that when the skeleton was found in 1949, it was concealed beneath some rubble because a tree bough had broken through the roof and created a hole, which I'm assuming would also bring some illumination into the room. It's also worth mentioning that even though the police's search of the cottage, the surrounding area, and the nearby pond began on March the 20th of that year, they still did not find anything until 2 whole days later, when Sergeant Thomas Waylett decided to start sifting through the rubble and finally found some skeletal remains. If a full-fledged search of a 2-room cottage involving multiple police officers could miss these remains for 2 days, I suppose the same thing could have happened during all the previous searches. During his testimony at the inquest, PC Constable was asked about what exactly he was looking for during his original search, and his response was, quote, "Nothing really. I had no intimation that Miss Kent was missing. I went to make the cottage secure against the children who were running all over it." End quote. When I hear him say that, it somehow doesn't seem as unbelievable that Constable could have missed seeing a skeleton wedged between a bed and a table inside a dark room. To be fair, it's possible that George Winkle performed more thorough search when he returned to the cottage in 1942, and he specifically said that he searched under the bed, but could he have still missed the remains in the darkness? I suppose one of the biggest holes in the theory about Connie's body being there the whole time is that nobody who entered Church Cottage reported detecting any foul odors, but nobody went into the cottage until months after Connie was last confirmed to be alive, and the pathologist said there was some evidence of mummification which may have been caused by the cold weather. Overall, this is definitely an unusual story, but once you learn the full facts, and put aside many of the highly embellished details, it suddenly doesn't seem all that implausible that everyone could have missed Connie's remains for an entire decade. But I suppose the other big unanswered question is, how exactly did Connie die? If she was murdered, it would make sense for her killer to intentionally conceal her body inside that narrow passage, but the authorities have always believed there was no evidence of foul play. Given that Connie was 67 years old and did not appear to be in the best of health during her final visit to the Whalebone Inn, it's perfectly reasonable to assume that Connie died of natural causes after she went to sleep that night and rolled off the bed. And if she landed badly, this could account for why her right shoulder appeared to be dislocated. But even though it hasn't been reported that Connie showed any noticeable signs of being suicidal, I can't completely discount the idea, thanks largely to a pair of details which sound embellished, yet are probably true because they were shared by reputable news sources. Of course, one of them is the empty body found next to the remains with the poison label on it, and the other is a copy of Romeo and Juliet being found open next to Connie's living room chair. Well, as you might recall, Romeo and Juliet concludes with Romeo fatally drinking poison, so given her alleged background in the theater, I could see Connie deciding to take her own life in the most theatrical way possible. It's also been reported that when the skeleton was found, the bed was still made and did not appear to have been slept in, and this would seem to go against the idea of Connie peacefully dying in her sleep. But perhaps I'm just reading too much into things, and Connie simply died a natural death, which somehow got turned into a mystery due to an unfortunate set of circumstances. However, if all the stories shared about her are true, then it sounds like Ada Constance Kent led a very interesting life, and if there's a silver lining to this whole situation, then at least the mysterious nature of this story has prevented Connie from falling into obscurity and ensured that she is not forgotten and lost to history. However, if by some small chance you happen to have any information about the death of Ada Constance Kent, please contact the appropriate authorities. But if you just have your own thoughts about what happened in this case, feel free to leave me a comment or send me an email to robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. One final reminder that this coming Saturday, October the 25th at 8 p.m. Eastern Time, we'll be holding one of our annual Halloween-themed Unsolved Mysteries Live Watch Marathons, in which I screen classic segments from the show, and you can watch them and chat with myself and your fellow listeners. If you'd like to join us, you can find the link to our screening room in our show notes and pinned at the top of our social media pages. Once again, it's taking place this coming Saturday at 8 p.m. Eastern Time, and we hope to see you there. And another reminder that The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so please visit patreon.com/thetrailwentcold to learn how you can support our podcast and become eligible for some pretty neat rewards. Over the past 7 years, our Patreon page has released nearly 90 exclusive bonus episodes which are all currently available in our archives for our patrons in tiers 2 and 3. This past month, I released a bonus episode about the bizarre and baffling 2001 murder of real estate agent Mike Emmert, which is technically considered to be solved, but still has a bunch of unanswered questions. I've also dropped an exclusive bonus episode from my spin-off podcast, The Path Went Chilly, in which myself and one of my co-hosts, Jules, discuss the 2001 disappearance and murder of Margie Dabney, an elderly woman who somehow went missing from an airport. And for our patrons in Tier 3, I recorded another new audio commentary track, which can be played over a classic episode of Unsolved Mysteries, and we now have nearly 80 of these commentary tracks in archives. I just wanted to give another shout out to my supporters at the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. I need to provide a big thanks to Miguel Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who composed the eerie music you hear on every episode. And as you probably noticed, we're going to be spending the rest of the month playing a special Halloween-themed version of the Trail Went Cold theme. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter and Instagram, or leave us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, YouTube Music, Podcast Addict, whatever your favorite podcasting platform is. So have yourselves a great week and join us next Wednesday for this month's final special Halloween-themed episode of The Trail Went Cold.